us. Adam is at the University of Florida. He's been there 9 years now. Native of North Carolina, did his degrees at NC State, the Wolfpack.
That's right.
Who did the awe? What was that?
Oh, I'm sorry. My husband was there.
Okay. So Adam and I know each other for a while. Adam does a lot of urban ecosystem things, everything from lawns to trees. And today he's gonna tell us a little bit about urban tree stuff.
Yeah.
Adam,
Thanks, Dave. Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. I am gonna talk about a lot of stuff. I was trying to be not too honed in on any given organism. So I'm trying to paint kind of broad strokes, and it is a little bit of a generalist presentation, but I thought I'd try to be as inclusive as I could be. So yeah, we'll dive right in and talk about, try to put a little context behind where we're supposed to put urban trees and things that we need to think about when we are creating urban ecosystems. So I really like maps, so I always like showing people illustrations and how landscapes change over time, because I'm really focused on urbanization and the changes that come with that. And so I think looking at aerial images of that process over time is a great way to just kind of capture the magnitude of that change. So this is, anybody been to Myrtle Beach or Conway? So this is the Myrtle Beach, Conway, South Carolina area. And this is an image from 1985. So 40 years ago. And then if we kind of slow-mo change this landscape to today, we'll see a few changes occur. What do you notice?
Where's the green space?
Yeah, it's the wetland areas that they couldn't build on, I suppose. And there's a golf course or two. But yeah, those are dramatic changes, right? That's a dramatic change to that landscape. Lots of agricultural land, lots of natural habitat transitioned into residential landscapes, downtown areas. And with that comes a lot of change. So this is kind of your typical depiction of what those landscapes have turned into. You got a gallery pear in the front yard, of course. But turf grass, shrubs, ornamentals, some trees. Hopefully you have some level of structure, but very typical. And when this is healthy, there's value to these landscapes, having vegetation in these spaces. But this is not what those spaces looked like before that neighborhood was built, right? It's a very different ecosystem now. We may have revegetated it, but it is not the same. And we know that insects and the things that live on the plants in those spaces respond to those changes. Driven by the plants that we put in there, but also the microclimate that is created by the way we create that landscape. So this is a figure that tries to get at depicting that. So I want you to think a little abstractly here. So in this figure, we have an urbanization gradient from natural to very urban. And we have changes that occur in that process. So across an urbanization gradient, you get urban heat islands, you get changes in microclimates, you get changes in sun exposure, pollution. You also get major changes to the plants that are in that space, from species to structure to complexity, diversity. And all those things influence organisms that use that habitat. So here, our circles are our predators, our parasites, our natural enemies, and the services they provide. Our squares are our herbivores or herbivory. And in nature, these things are relatively imbalanced. But when we go through an urbanization process, those things get all thrown out of whack. So some things might make it fine. They remain relatively unchanged through urbanization. Some things become significantly diminished. Some things become imbalanced. Some things disappear. And things become imbalanced in the other direction. And so when that happens, we get biodiversity loss, we get herbivore outbreaks, we have pest problems. And the way my lab looks at this is through an integrated pest management approach, how can we look at all these changes and try to restore some of the balance that existed over here on the left side before we came in and changed that landscape. So as Dave said, my lab really focuses on the whole landscape. If you're a bug in a lawn, on a herbaceous plant in a garden, or on a tree, that kind of falls under the umbrella of what we study, and really trying to restore biodiversity in these spaces, but also understand how to manage the insects and plants that live in these spaces after we develop those. But for the sake of today, we're just gonna focus on trees. Because trees are really where my heart lies. And trees are really great, right? I'm sure no one in here thinks that trees are no good, unless it is a killer here. They provide a lot of environmental, ecological, human health benefits in cities and urban residential spaces. And our goal is to have areas like this. This is a street on our campus at the University of Florida, lined with huge live oaks, tons of shade. There's tons of creatures living in these trees. There's tons of carbon being sequestered. These are valuable habitats. But this is the goal, and getting to that point is not easy. The way that we kind of think about this from a landscape design and management approach is through this phrase, right plant, right place. So you got to put a plant where it's going to thrive so that it can eventually become those giant live oaks. And this is something that is really overused. It kind of gets really old thinking of hearing this phrase, but it's matching plants to their planting site based on things like their hardiness zone. Can that tree grow to a mature size without having to be topped or pruned? Soil conditions, not an invasive species, and then ideally not reliant on intensive management after you put that plant in the landscape. So this is kind of what everybody uses to justify what plants they're gonna put in the landscape. But I would argue this is way too simplified because urban ecosystems are not simple ecosystems. And one reason they're not simple is because there's a lot of creatures that exploit urban conditions. And when you put a plant in a city versus that plant in its natural habitat, the insects that live on that plant behave differently. And scale insects, which is what all these creatures are one of the best examples of insects that exploit urban ecosystems and become pests when they're on a plant in a city versus a plant in nature. Many of these are native, some of them are not. We do have lots of invasive scale insects. But in both scenarios, they seem to behave like invasive organisms when you put them in a city. So I would argue this has to be part of the right place equation. So when we're thinking about right plant, right place, we got to think about the critters that live on those plants and the outcomes of putting that plant in a stressful urban situation. So today I said I'm going to try to paint broad strokes because I want to talk about a lot of stuff, and it's hard to talk about a lot of stuff in 45 minutes. So I'm going to touch on 3 different short stories about what happens when you look at plants in urban settings. What are the outcomes for those plants? When we think about pests, when we think about the people that really dominate these spaces, and when we think about pathogens, which I'm not an expert in, but dabbling in. So pests, I mentioned scale insects. Scale insects have long been recognized as an urban plant pest. I really love this photo in particular, but this old paper from 1912, which is really documenting and making the case that scale insects are the #1 problem on urban trees. And anybody have any ideas what's going on in this picture here? So there's a guy in the tree, there's a guy at the bottom of the tree. The guy at the bottom of the tree is pumping pumping the tank and the guy at the top is spraying all the scales in the tree. I think with kerosene. And I'm not sure what kind of PPE this guy has on, but probably not adequate. But yeah, so we know scale insects have long been a pest, and in this article, they point this out, but then they also point out that unlike San Jose scale, which is an invasive species and was a huge problem back then, even native scale insects become incredibly problematic on trees in cities, but not in nature. And so we'll focus for a minute on red maples. So red maples are an incredibly common native tree, native throughout the eastern half of North America. But they are also the most common tree planted in urban and residential settings as an ornamental. By far the most common urban tree. Well, maybe crepe myrtles may have displaced that at this point, but crepe myrtles and red maples are right up there. On red maples, the gloomy scale is a native armored scale insect that feeds on maple trees generally. It's a native species, but it is way more abundant on urban red maples than maples in nature. And this is an example of what we see on urban maples. All those little bumps are individual scale insects. And if you flip that armored covering up, there's a little soft bodied scale insect tapped into the vascular tissue of that plant, sucking sap out of the tree. The outcomes of that are direct damage to the tree, declines in tree health. So we get leaf drop, branch dieback, and gradual, it's a real chronic, slow decline and death of the plant. And so I think a good illustration of that is, so here we have a nice clean red maple in a front yard. And here is another red maple about the same size, maybe a mile away. And the same, well, not the same setting, but this thing is not in the shade. It is dark because it's caked in scale insects. So all that darkness are scale insect covers piled up all over the trunk and woody tissue. So that's the severity that you get to and when these things really get out of control. And we've learned over the past 10 years that urban heat islands are really a big driver of gloomy scale outbreaks. And so urban heat islands are just basically islands of warmer temperatures associated with pavement and buildings associated with cities. So if you look at this aerial image, this is Raleigh, North Carolina. You can see the gray areas. So downtown dominated by buildings and pavement, and the major corridors that runs along the north side of NC State. This runs up. So when you look at the surface temperature of these gray spaces compared to the green forested areas, there's a dramatic difference in the climate of those spaces, the microclimates they experience. So gray is hot, green is cool, and that creates very different climates that these trees and the insects on those trees experience within really close proximity to one another. So you can have a tree a mile from another tree, and those trees are experiencing several degree differences in tree canopy temperature, water stress, and they have crazy differences in scale insects. So using these urban heat islands, we can kind of create a ready-made experiment of temperature variation within a city and look at how trees within that are experiencing scale insects and that environment. And all these little green dots are red maple trees. So those are all street trees, red maples across this metropolitan area. And we've done a lot of work surveying gloomy scales on those maple trees. And what we see, and measuring tree canopy temperature and a lot of other metrics at the local level. And what we see is that as tree canopy temperature increases on average from 18 to 21-ish, we get about a 200-fold increase in the number of scales per unit area in that tree canopy. So here at our cool trees, we've got a beautiful red maple branch, and at our hot trees, this is what it looks like. So dramatic changes in scale and sex. And we started digging a little deeper, looking at these organisms, and so this is an adult female Bloomy scale. For actual scale, this is about 1 millimeter in diameter. But she is full of babies, and so we dissected a bunch of these females on all these trees across this gradient of temperature to see if there was a difference in their reproductive output. And we also measured water stress on those trees. So we manipulated how much water some were getting and others were. So we had a drought stress treatment and a water treatment to see how do they respond to temperature and how do they respond to water stress in trees. And so the way we did that is we put these irrigation bags on the base of the trees. At each site, we had a watered tree and an unwatered tree. And that tree got a lot of water for 2 years. And then we measured how many babies scales on those trees were producing. So here we have again our tree canopy temperature on the x-axis, and then on the y-axis is the number of eggs per female on those trees. And what we see is that for every degree increase in temperature, an adult female is producing about 14 more eggs per individual. And there's an additive effect of water stress. So our water stressed trees, I believe on average are producing 12% more eggs per adult female than our watered trees. So there's this additive effect of temperature and water stress on scale insect fitness. And that translates to 200 times as many scale insects, greater reproductive output, and what for the trees. So I'm really interested in the bugs, and I think it's fascinating to see what's happening to the bugs, but what ultimately matters is the outcomes for the trees, because we're trying to grow healthy trees and healthy urban forests. So to get at that question, we went back to all those trees and we quantified the number of trees basically that looked like this versus the number of trees that looked like this. Not that superficially, lots of metrics went into quantifying those conditions, but what we found is that hot sites where there were more scale insects had about twice as many trees in poor condition, and cool sites with fewer scales had about twice as many trees in excellent condition than poor condition. So there are tree health outcomes linked to these environmental changes. And those changes can be at a very small scale within a city. They can be you can have a maple tree in a neighborhood, and then right outside the neighborhood in a parking lot of a doctor's office, there is a tree covered in scales, and those scales are pumping out babies and causing tree decline. So it's at a very fine resolution. So getting back to this right plant, right place idea, really what my lab does and what I'm really motivated by is trying to develop solutions for practitioners. So people who are designing urban landscapes, people who are managing the plants in those landscapes, how can they use this information to improve the outcomes of their decisions? And so we were trying to think about how they might be able to use that. They're not gonna put data loggers in trees to measure average tree canopy temperature. They're not gonna count thousands of scale insects on plants. They're not gonna measure water stress. But what they can do is they can look at these sites and see tangible changes in the landscape around these planting sites or around the tree. And so one thing we see that changes from this tree to this tree to this tree to this tree is the amount of pavement around that tree. And the driver of urban heat islands is pavement. Paved surfaces increase temperatures, increase water stress, which are associated with scale insect outbreaks. All of that combined causes tree decline. So can we use the amount of pavement around a planting site to inform where a tree should be planted in a urban setting? That's the question. So we went back to that inventory of thousands of trees, looked where each of those trees were planted, and then we quantified how much pavement was around that tree. And then looked for associations between the amount of pavement around a tree and the condition that that tree was in. From poor to fair to good to excellent. And this figure is kind of crazy looking, so let me break it down really quickly. So here we have, on the x-axis, we have the percentage of impervious surface around a planting site. So from 0% to 100% pavement around where a tree is planted. On the vertical axis, we have the likelihood that that tree is in one of those condition ratings. So the likelihood that that tree is poor condition, fair, good, or excellent. And then the colors that you're going to see are each of those condition ratings. And then there's a bunch of different lines associated with each color. Just blur those together to one line. So what this shows us is that as the amount of pavement around a planting site increases from 0 to 100%. If you look at our green lines, that's our good trees. The likelihood of a tree being in good condition goes down as the amount of pavement around that tree increases. And our orange lines is our poor condition. The likelihood of it being in poor condition increases as you get more pavement. And so if you look at these lines, so good, fair, poor, you can see these inflection points where the likelihood, most likely condition goes from good to fair and from fair to poor. And those are what we're treating as thresholds of pavement around a planting site that predicts the outcome of that planting decision or the management intensity that that tree is going to need if it's already planted in that site. So for example, if you have less than 32% impervious surface around a planting site, that tree is probably going to be in good shape, have low scale densities, and have a good outcome. If you're between 32 and 62, you're going to be most likely fair condition. You might need supplemental irrigation. You might need supplemental management inputs. And if you're over 62, then that is not a good outlook in terms of long-term tree health because you're going to look like that. So these are our thresholds of impervious surface to help guide tree planting decisions and management after planting based on local measurable conditions. And we've expanded this work to see how this varies across the East Coast. So all that work was based in North Carolina. But how do trees in Gainesville or trees in Savannah or trees in Delaware respond to these changes in local conditions? I swear we didn't intentionally leave out South Carolina. But so we went to each of these cities, used their tree inventory data to quantify gloomy scale densities, measure pavement around the trees, and then look at these condition ratings. And what we find is that impervious surface is still a good predictor of temperature in the trees, scale densities, and tree condition. But scale insects don't respond as uniformly across that latitudinal gradient. So for example, they peak in mid-latitude cities. So Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh, that's really where scale insect densities thrive or reach really high levels, and then they kind of peter out at the southernmost and northernmost ends, which is linked to thermal tolerance and possibly biological control on those ends. But the thresholds remain relatively consistent. So we identified those inflection points across all the cities. And on average, if you're less than 36%, that's a pretty good outcome. If you're between 36 and 61, you need to be careful. Over 61 is don't plant. Or if you do have a tree there, it's not going to be a good outcome. So that was reassuring that it remained fairly consistent. But again, this is for one tree species, the most common tree, but one tree. So urban conditions, increase pluvia scales, increase tree stress. Those have outcomes for tree health, but we can use things like measurable landscape characteristics to predict those outcomes and inform our management decisions. But one question is, can we broaden this to other species and other factors associated with urban ecosystems? Because urban ecosystems, again, are very complex systems. Here's another aerial image. I think this is a series of images from a photographer that are really fascinating, that I encourage you to look up, by Johnny Miller. So we know that economic well-being shapes urban communities and urban plant communities in particular. So across a city, you have areas that are segregated and have been for a long time based on socioeconomic status and economic well-being. And in some cases, you may have dramatically different situations in really close proximity to economically prosperous settings. And the trees and the vegetation here are very different from over here. So how can we account for that? Or can we account for that when we're making planting decisions? Because we know if we're trying to put vegetation, put trees in these areas that have been historically neglected, those places have less tree canopy. They're hotter, most likely. So they're already going to be more stressful situations to plop a tree into, which means they likely need more TLC after planting. But the people who live in those places typically have other priorities than caring for the tree in their front yard, right? So how can we consider these things, and does the right place for a plant also vary by local economic factors and economic well-being? So to get at this question, we've been doing some work in Atlanta, and my student Daniel and research technician Gabby have been leading a lot of this work. But Atlanta's a great, huge metropolitan area, but it also has very distinct socioeconomic segments of the city. And so we've been using this index called the Distressed Communities Index, which creates quintiles of economic distress based on US Census data, like unemployment rate, vacancy rates, education, that kind of thing. And so what this shows is that, so the index, number 1 is the most economically prosperous, and number 5 is the most economically distressed. And in Atlanta, that really plays out from like a northwest side of the city is economically prosperous, and then this central to southern side of the downtown area is economically distressed. And so we're using this kind of also as a ready-made experiment, but also Atlanta has a wealth of data on their urban forest, and they have an incredible program, Trees Atlanta, that's been planting trees there since the 80s. And they've planted 170,000 trees since 1985, and they keep track of all that. So they know where they planted trees, what tree species it was, the size, all these other things. So that's a great resource. So we partnered with Trees Atlanta and the city of Atlanta to try to answer a few questions, broadening out from red maples, but also looking at some of these economic well-being questions. So we picked 5 tree species: crepe myrtle, white oak, red maple, sweet bay magnolia, and tulip poplar. Each of these trees is a host plant for an insect, either a scale insect or an aphid that is known to exploit urban conditions. So each of these trees is susceptible to an urban tree pest. And so we picked trees that were all planted in 2019 at the same size, and then visited those last year to try to get a little idea of how these things were playing out. And we picked 12 per species per economic category. So then DCI 1 and DCI 5, we left out the middle ones because logistically we cannot visit thousands of trees. But we had 2 categories. And then we collected a bunch of data, so tree height, tree diameter, scale insect density, and several other things. And then looked to see if there were relationships between local planting conditions, like I was just talking about, like the amount of pavement around a tree planting, or the economic well-being of the neighborhood where that tree was planted. And this is really kind of a teaser because we're in the middle of this project, so I don't have a complete story here. But what we're seeing so far is that scale insect density increases with impervious surface cover, like we saw before. But with red maple, like we've already shown very well, and tulip tree scale on tulip poplar. Crepe myrtle, magnolia, and white oak, the insects on those plants did not respond to the amount of pavement around the planting site. We also found that trees in the economically prosperous neighborhoods were about 21% bigger than the trees in the economically distressed neighborhoods. But it again varied by species. So really our red maples, our tulip poplars, and our white oaks were significantly larger in DCI 1 than they were in DCI 5. And I think this photo gives you a good example of what that looks like. So here's a DCI 1 tulip poplar, DCI 5 tulip poplar, planted at the same size, at the same time, and that is an outcome based on the economic status of that neighborhood. So what we're seeing, things are species dependent. You can't treat all tree species and the organisms that feed on those the same, which makes sense. That's what we predicted. And that local economic well-being does influence the outcomes of those tree plantings. As of now, just based on some basic tree size metrics. The big question is why? And we're currently working with Trees Atlanta to help understand that. But I would say so far what we're seeing is that tulip tree and red maple should be really planted in areas that have low impervious surface area. We know that from red maples, we've known that for red maples for a long time. But tulip poplar is another one that should be considered in that. We also need to make sure that quality control and installation standards are consistent across economic well-being levels. This is something we're working on right now, trying to figure out, but the people who are selecting the plants and installing the plants in a DCI Zone 1 neighborhood, are those the same people that are doing it in DCI Zone 5? And after planting, what kind of care do they receive over that next 5 years? Our data suggests that care post-planting varies, and the ones in DCI 5 might be relatively neglected. All right, my last little short story has to do with pathogens, and this is another relatively recent endeavor, but another one that's been really fun to start learning about. Anybody have any idea what state that might be in? It's Florida. So Florida is, palms are a big deal in Florida. If you go to South Florida, you tend to expect to see palms in the landscape. And palm production is a $400 million industry in Florida alone. So it's a pretty big deal. We're urbanizing more rapidly than anywhere else in the country. About 1,100 people move to Florida every day. And our landscapes are rapidly being converted to spaces for those people to live. And palms are going to remain a fixture of that landscape, most likely. So our director of tourism development said that palms are the look and feel of Florida. How many native palms would you say we have in the state of Florida? So we have about, I think there's like 40 species of palms used in the landscape. There's 12 that are native, but of the native ones, really 3 or 4 are really widely used as landscape plants. But I'm getting distracted. This is the recent state of palms. And this is one of our native ones that you all have in South Carolina, but also sable palmetto. But throughout the state, this is a frequent observation on a lot of our landscape palms. The canopy starts to die back at the bottom, that progresses up the plant to the spear leaf, the growing point. And then that whole canopy collapses and the plant dies every time. And this is caused by a phytoplasma that is vectored by an insect. So phytoplasmas are kind of like bacteria without a cell wall. They're obligate parasites of plants, and they need a host plant or need a host organism. So they're vectored by insects, plant hoppers, and then transmitted to the plant. And every time, if they're transmitted into the plant dies. It's always lethal. In Florida, we have 2 phytoplasmas that affect palms, so lethal yellowing and lethal bronzing. Both are vectored by this plant hopper, Aplaxius crudus, which is a little succeeded plant hopper. As a nymph, it feeds in grassy ground cover. As an adult, it feeds in palm canopies. And that's when it vectors the pathogen to palms. The current approach to managing this thing is preventive inputs. So, because remember, if the palm gets it, it dies. So you can't risk a palm getting the disease if that palm is a valuable asset in the landscape. So preventive injections of antibiotic, preventive applications of systemic insecticides to the palms, so that if an adult lands in the palm, it dies before it transmits the pathogen. And preventive applications of insecticides to the turf around palms to reduce nymph habitat. So needless to say, this is not a sustainable approach to managing for this pest. This is one outcome of those multiple injections, but we're putting a lot of inputs into the environment that have a lot of known negative impacts, and we're not considering a lot of those impacts. For example, palms are incredibly pollinator attractive, but that's bad news if this palm is being very actively preventively managed. The trick is some of our palms, like our Canary Island date palms, our royal palms that people have in their landscape that are 30, 50 feet tall, that's really irreplaceable. If that thing dies, you're not gonna get another one of those. That's a $40,000 plant at that size. So people really care about protecting these plants. And this is an example of those plants that are of that value. So kind of like what we talked about initially with red maples, we started thinking, okay, can we predict disease risk based on local conditions as a way to inform management, preventive management, but also inform planting sites to reduce the likelihood of a palm dying after it goes in. So based on where it's planted, can we predict disease risk? And we know that impervious surface influences several things, like I've shown. We would predict that neighbors also may influence a palm's risk. So is that palm obstructed? Is it as accessible from a flying insect? Are there neighbor interactions? And we know the nymphs thrive in wet grassy ground cover. So if a palm is near a wet grassy ground cover area, is that going to have a higher risk of infection? And I partnered with Kerry Harmon and Brian Bader at UF, who both run diagnostic labs where they test palms for phytoplasmas. So if a landscape company or a homeowner thinks their palm might have a phytoplasma, they collect some trunk tissue, send that to the lab, and they determine if that phytoplasma is present in that tissue. And so over the past 7 years, they've built up a database of 6,000 tissue samples that they know the host plant, they know where it came from, and they know if it had the phytoplasma or not. And so I was like, wow, this is a great resource. Maybe we can use this to answer this question of, can we predict where a palm is gonna most likely be infected? And so 7,000 trees turned into 128 trees, which was kind of a bummer, but based on a bunch of selection criteria and being very confident about the information that was around that palm, this is what we wound up with. But a pretty good distribution all over the state of Florida. And we set out to see if percent pavement around the palm, the number of palms around the palm, the percent of grassy ground cover, and then we calculated this wetness index to predict soil moisture. Put all that into a model to see if we could predict the likelihood of a disease detection. So yes or no, pathogen detected. And in short, what we found is that grassy ground cover did not matter, wetness did not matter, but the likelihood of infection increased as the percent of pavement around the planting site increased. And it increased as a palm had fewer neighbors. So the more palm neighbors you have, the less likely you are to have the pathogen. So this palm, this very dry, sad looking palm is a great example of the prime conditions where we would predict a phytoplasma infection. No neighbors and a ton of pavement because it's on a little island by itself in the middle of the road. So having neighbors is critical for reducing risk of infection. So a lone palm surrounded by hardscape seems to be the most vulnerable. So a right place for a palm in Florida right now seems to be low to moderate impervious surface around it and as many neighbors as they can have. We've used these models to create some simplified tables that kind of predict risk based on how much pavement is around that planting site and how many palms are around that planting. So if you have 87% pavement and 0 neighbors, 76% likelihood of infection. But as you increase your neighbors, your infection risk goes down, and as you decrease pavement, infection risk goes down. So hopefully being able to use something like this to inform preventive management inputs and palm plant site selection. Right now, we're trying to get at why these things matter. So one of our hypotheses were that maybe a lone palm is just a very easily colonized plant. It's very apparent to the plant hopper. So it's going to have higher colonization rates of the plant hoppers. We're still trying to answer that question. We surveyed plant hoppers in palms at low impervious surface levels and widely varying palm densities. And there's no effect on plant hopper density. But right now we're working on surveying palms that vary in densities at really high impervious surface levels. So we'll see what's going on here, but it's again another complex situation. So hopefully I've convinced you that landscape design and plant selection matters for outcomes for urban trees. Also that cities are very complex socio-ecological systems. People are and probably the most important piece of the puzzle. And they have to be included in most urban ecology work. Guidelines like impervious surface thresholds can help direct more successful, sustainable urban greening efforts. And this is only going to become more problematic, more prevalent. Cities are growing, our population is growing. This is only becoming more of an issue. So we need to try to get ahead of it as much as we can, or we're never gonna get ahead of it, but catch up to it as much as we can for better outcomes. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions, and thank you for having me, and thank you for your attention.
Hey, Brian, questions, folks?
Would you work on like red maple and scale besides the water stress and the impervious surface? Did you look at like mulching around the trees? Does that have any effect on the infestation?
So we didn't necessarily look for an effective mulching around the tree. We tried to standardize all of our trees to have the same level of mulch and have correct planting conditions. So like a super common thing is to have the mulch volcanoes that they just pile as much mulch up around it. So we didn't have any trees that were in that situation. I would say that a mulch situation that is going to increase stress likely translates to more scales, but beyond that, it's hard to say. Yes.
Thank you for making this all inclusive for horticulturists like myself. Thank you. My pleasure. So with the gloomy scale, what is the advantage for this critter to attack trees that probably have their carbohydrate status might be less than a very healthy tree? Why do you have these increases in the reproductive rate on trees that are extremely stressed? And they're flow feeders, right?
So they're not feeding on the phloem.
Oh,
They're feeding on individual parenchyma cells within the tissue.
okay.
But one of our hypotheses is that they are benefiting from increased free amino acid buildup in that tissue from being water stressed. We haven't been able to empirically, well, actually, we have some data that shows that red maples that are at those hot water stress sites have higher nitrogen content in their phloem. But that's in like a spreadsheet and a data book somewhere in a pile. That's one of our hypotheses, is that they are benefiting from nutrient changes in the plant because of the stress.
Okay. I got a few more, but those two up front.
Samantha.
So when you're looking at the Atlanta data with the different DCI areas, so you only had the two species that you were seeing like the big difference in between areas 1 and 5, just like the red maples and the tulips. Do you think for the other species where you weren't seeing as much of a difference, it's just like that they require less care and that's why there's not a big difference in how they're turning out in those lower economic areas? Or what do you think?
Yes, that's a good question. I think it's complicated. It's more complicated than I would like because we aren't going to be able to explain as much of it as I would want to. Part of it has to do with where the trees are planted. So like a crepe myrtle, for example, most of the crepe myrtles are street trees. Whereas the red maples and tulip poplars are oftentimes in a front yard or a street tree or in a park. So I think that planting site matters in terms of the care it gets and the conditions it experiences. But beyond that, I'm not sure. I don't know. It seems like post-planting care is probably driving a difference, like irrigation. But from what we saw, not all irrigation is very random, it seems. So I don't know. I'm hoping to have a very productive conversation with Trees Atlanta to try to figure that out.
Did you or will you consider like the diversity of trees? So especially for like street trees, do you think there might be a relationship between the stress? So like if it's crepe myrtle or something else, red maple, and it's just a street plant with that species, do you think including diversity into that street would help reduce stress? And you know, if you have like the heat island effect, but if you have biodiversity, if you're increasing the species of trees, do you think that can have an impact?
So it has So my colleague at NC State has done some work trying to answer that question. There is value to increasing diversity along at a relatively small scale in terms of supporting more diverse, greater biodiversity, and then the services that come along with that. I don't know how that would translate to tree outcomes necessarily in terms of growth survival in our Atlanta system. One thing that we do know is that from other cities like Baltimore, they've seen that a lot of these efforts to regreen these historically neglected neighborhoods have resulted in plantings that have lower diversity because they've planted trees that they're trying to match that right plant, right place for the site, but the outcome of that is a very homogeneous tree community that then has all these other negative implications. So those are some data that we're going to collect in the Atlanta sites. I don't know yet what it looks like, but I think that's an important piece of the puzzle.
So I've learned over the years that essentially whoever touches the tree last owns it. So after these trees are planted, is it required of a resident, let's say if you put it one of those verges or hell strips in front of their home, are they responsible to maintain it, or how does Trees Atlanta handle the post-planting establishment period? Who's responsible?
Right, that's a good question. So my understanding from talking with them is that they are responsible for 2 years after planting, and then it's either left to its own or the resident where the tree was planted becomes the caretaker. But if that tree is in an island or in a park, I expect that it just kind of is left to survive if it's going to survive, but not get much care.
And just one follow-up to that, when you mentioned these species, like the tulip poplar and the white oak, they really caught my attention because these white oaks, they're not street trees. They need over 200 square feet, similar to a tulip poplar, unless you work with a cultivar. That's like under 40 feet, but we're looking at these big, massive statuesque trees. And that's the trees Atlanta is planting in these impervious spaces.
Yeah, so that's an important point. That's a good point. And that gets back to kind of the variability in planting sites. So I know our tulip poplars are mostly planted in front yards or parks where there's less pavement. And I suspect the white oaks are similar. So they're not all street trees. They're not all planted in these terrible conditions. But that's part of the problem, and making sense of it is that our species is in some ways confounded by our planting site. So separating those effects is really challenging. But yeah, you're right. That's what the tulip poplars, the old tulip poplars in Atlanta are incredible. But it's hard for me to imagine the new ones ever becoming that size.
Thank you.
Go ahead, you guys.
It was a nice presentation on the urban trees. So what was your like sampling distribution around the city? Like what is your like what do you think, how many samples needs to be there? And what are the criteria for the poor, fair and the excellent trees you have used?
For the Atlanta project? Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of details in there. So we isolated those 2 zones of economic well-being, and then within those zones, we identified 12 individuals of each species, so 60 trees, but each tree was separated. Each tree of the same species was at least 1 kilometer apart, I think. And then we tried to have as uniform a distribution across that zone of economic well-being. But we randomly picked trees within that zone. So it's like this, it's a stratified random sampling procedure to randomly pick trees that meet some specific criteria. But they were all the same size at planted in the same year. And had good data. The other thing we learned that just because there's a data point on the map doesn't mean that tree is still there or was ever put there. So a lot of the sites where we showed up, there was no tree there, or it was a tree of a different species. So there was a lot of ground truthing also. So that's another layer that didn't really account for. Hopefully that answered your question. Someone back there? Yeah.
Great talk. You mentioned your decision support tools that help landscape architects and other folks know where to plant trees. Are those tools solely focused on tree health, or do you incorporate other ecological knowledge and stuff into those decision support tools?
Right now, they're only focused on tree health and insect pests. Ideally, they would broaden out to focus on biodiversity conservation, providing wildlife habitat, food. So that's the goal. We're trying to build out those resources, but it's quite the undertaking. But we are collaborating with our landscape architecture folks at UF, our wildlife folks, horticulture folks, trying to bring as many people in that work in these systems to create more comprehensive recommendations. And we have, I showed a screenshot early on of the Right Plant, Right Place. That's our Florida Friendly Landscaping Program. And that is really an excellent vehicle to roll out a lot of this information. And it's a state program that has state line funding support to help encourage and in some cases mandate following specific practices that promote wildlife and support biodiversity. So that's hopefully the vehicle that will build that out through.
Go ahead, Bob.
Me again. So I really enjoyed your work, Dr. Dale, with also Dr. Frank, your pace to plant technique. I think it's just invaluable.
Thank you.
But the struggle that I have is trying to take your information and make it available to landscape architects, civil engineers, city planners. How do you reach that audience? Because I often work with maintenance, the contractors that can maintain these plants, and they're stuck. You know, they've got a mess on
They've
it.
been dealt.
Yeah, but how do you go to the source and share your information with them so they can start implementing that?
Yeah, that's a barrier that we have run into. I've given several talks to landscape architecture groups. I forget the name of the organization. Florida has a landscape architecture society or group. I've interacted with them several times and tried to really get this information to them. One, to just help them see, like, look, these design decisions have outcomes. So these are things you need to consider. Those have always been well received, but the implementation step, the most important step, still is really slow to take hold. So I'm not sure what the best solution is. That's the goal, though, to get them, that audience, to implement things, because otherwise we're all just being set up to have a hard time managing plants.
Wonderful.
Well, I tried to get Z's question up here, kind of a follow-up. You've got good data that shows, you know, when you put trees in isolated situations surrounded by pavement, they're probably gonna fail, right? And then we're always gonna have these situations because of all the building and the urbanization, right? There's always gonna be little chunks of concrete with 5 cubic feet of dirt in it, and they're gonna want a tree in there. What should they put in there instead? Like, do we have recommendations for stuff that actually will survive that?
A great murder.
That's like shrubs. I mean, are there places where trees just shouldn't be put in there?
I struggle with that question. I think about that frequently. In Florida, a palm is a great choice. Until now, we know that a lone palm is like a beacon for pathogen infection. But there's not a lot of options for something that can tolerate that condition. I think this is where this is a whole different debate, but the native versus non-native plant argument, I think we have a lot of non-native urban trees that seem to be able to tolerate those really awful conditions. Things like crepe myrtles, but they've become too overplanted. So branching out to things, shoot, I have a list of like Chinese pistache seems to be one. I haven't worked with it in a long time, but it seems like one that does okay. Not native. Persian ironwood, not native, but
Do we have any native options?
I don't think so. I mean, well, so let me say, I don't know. I don't know of native options that seem to do well. In Florida, winged elm seems to tolerate tough conditions pretty well. So people use that a lot, like in north central Florida, winged elm is a pretty common choice.
I asked because I struggle with this too, and because I deal with some of this stuff too, and Bob, I'm sure you get some of this, like, what do you tell people?
Yeah.
I mean, at some point, just pave the damn thing over and be done with it.
Yeah.
Nothing's
Rocks
wrong with it.
are beautiful. Rocks are beautiful.
I mean, and I look at our, see, I'm trying to get you, hold on a minute. So we've got this big, youth sports complex where we, at our place. And there's a bunch of little, they're basically 3 foot by 12 foot chunks of dirt surrounded by concrete, and they've shoved 2 red maples in there. And keep in mind, this is a youth sports complex. So every 5-year-old with their first pair of cleats is up there testing them out, and every kid with their baseball bat is hitting them. And it's like, why are you even putting anything there without I guess without thinking about what is gonna happen in this area?
Right.
You're asking all these people to bring all their kids with their first bat and their first cleat, that's gonna just go on everything that sticks out of the ground. So rocks, honestly, is the only thing that would realistically survive that,
Where they put a barrier around.
or a barrier, yeah, one of the two. I don't know, I think about that as I see these things all the time, I'm like, well, they're gonna die next year, and sure enough, they're dead, and they put another 3 inch in there, and I think, well, that's just a fresh target.
Yeah, I joke about crepe myrtles, but I think if you put a crepe myrtle in a spot like that and you properly prune it and train it into a nice shade tree,
Nice flat top.
no, don't do that. I think that can create a really nice, very hardy tree in a stressful spot.
Okay. Z, do I just ask Z to unmute?
Yes.
Hey, Adam, can you guys hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, very nice presentation, and I had a question regarding the invasive species issue, because yeah, these recommendations are very important and they are really helping landscapers when they are planting trees in the landscape. But when it comes to non-native, newly established invasive species of scale insects, like we have example of crepe myrtle bark scale, you think these guidelines would still be as helpful as in case of those scales which are maybe they are non-native, but they are already established for a long time? That was my question.
okay, yeah, thanks, Z, that's a good question. I think, as with everything, it depends. We tend to see that even non-native scale insects respond to these changes at the local scale. So like I do an exercise in Orlando when I host a training in Orlando that I do frequently, and one of our activities is to go out and do the paste to plant and quantify the amount of pavement around several different tree species in the landscape, and then survey those trees for scale insects. And what we see is that generally, and maybe, I mean, this is one site, so it's one data point. But we see non-native scales on plants at higher densities when they have more pavement around them, regardless of origin. So I think it can still be used as a proxy and maybe a rough predictor of scale infestation and density. But invasive species kind of always throw a wrench in things. So that's my take on it. I think it can still be a helpful predictor, but it may not be a hard rule. But for example, so Z, we're doing some work with Phantasma scale now. So Phantasma scale is another armored scale. This is an invasive species that's in Florida and it affects palms. We've been surveying palms for scale insects and we're finding palms in a parking lot have more scales on than palms in a forest or in a real natural setting. This is just some initial observations, but it seems to be holding true still, regardless of origin. So yeah, that's just me thinking out loud, but I think it still has some utility.
Yes, thank you, Adam.
Yep.
All right, with that, thanks, Adam. Good talk. Students, in here, lunch. I'll see you later.
Take some of these, it's either zero or it's like. They're from leftover from Bill's work for BSS. Okay, yes, put them over here because we got some of the. Yes. Please take some. Oh, yeah.
So excited.
Yes. Don't run away.
I'm okay.